They say the most dangerous man in a room isn't the one shouting threats, it's the one watching in silence, calculating your end before you even know you're a target. In the humid, unforgiving streets of 1960s Miami, there lived a man whose name would eventually be whispered with the same reverence reserved for ghosts and demons, Charles Harrison. They called him the Executioner, not because he was loud, not because he was flashy, but because when Charles decided you were done, you simply ceased to exist. No drama, no witnesses, just gone. But every monster has an origin story. And Charles Harrison's began not in the neon-lit chaos of Miami's criminal underworld, but in the rotting, forgotten neighborhoods of Liberty City, where poverty wasn't just a condition, it was a death sentence served slowly, one disappointment at a time. Picture this: a sweltering August afternoon in 1962. The air is thick enough to choke on, and the smell of garbage fermenting in the Florida heat mingles with the salt from the distant ocean. In a cramped, roach-infested apartment on Northwest 12th Avenue, 7-year-old Charles Harrison sits perfectly still at a kitchen table, scarred with cigarette burns and the ghosts of 1,000 violent arguments. His mother, Diane, is passed out on the couch again, an empty bottle of cheap vodka on the floor beside her limp hand. His father? Well, Marcus Harrison is 3 years into a 10-year stretch at Rayford State Prison for armed robbery, a man Charles barely remembers, existing only as a collection of fragmented memories, the smell of motor oil, the sound of his mother crying, and one vivid image of his father's hands, massive and scarred, counting money at that very same kitchen table. But what's remarkable about young Charles isn't the poverty or the absent father or the alcoholic mother. Those were common currencies in Liberty City. What set him apart was the stillness. While other children in the neighborhood screamed and played and fought for attention, Charles watched. He observed. He learned. The neighbors used to say there was something off about the Harrison boy. Mrs. Delacroix, the Haitian woman who lived downstairs, once told a friend that Charles had old eyes that had seen too much, too early, and had made peace with darkness most children couldn't even imagine. School records from Robert E. Lee Elementary paint a contradictory picture. Teachers described him as exceptionally intelligent but disturbingly quiet. He never caused trouble, never raised his hand, never engaged in the typical chaos of childhood. But his test scores were remarkable, particularly in mathematics and problem-solving. One teacher, Mrs. Patricia Greenberg, wrote in a 1964 evaluation, "Charles possesses an almost frightening ability to see patterns where others see only chaos. He could excel at anything he chooses. I only hope he chooses wisely." She wouldn't get her wish. The turning point, the moment that would set Charles Harrison on his dark trajectory, came on a November evening in 1967 when he was 12 years old. His mother had been sober for 3 weeks, the longest stretch in years. She'd even gotten a job cleaning offices downtown, and for a brief, shining moment, Charles allowed himself to believe things might actually get better. That evening, Diane Harrison came home from work with groceries, real groceries, not just the canned goods from the food bank. She had a smile on her face, and she'd brought Charles a gift, a book about codes and ciphers from the library book sale. She knew her son loved puzzles, loved the mathematical precision of secrets locked and unlocked. They cooked dinner together that night. Charles can still remember the smell of her perfume mixed with the chicken frying on the stove, the way she hummed while she cooked, the possibility of normalcy hanging in the air like a promise. At 9:47 p.m., 3 men kicked in the door. They were looking for money they claimed Marcus Harrison had stolen before his incarceration, some half-forgotten debt from a robbery gone wrong years earlier. The leader, a man named Raymond "Slick" Peters, was high on something that made his eyes look like broken glass. He screamed at Diane, demanding money she didn't have, payment for debts she didn't owe. Charles, who had been reading his new book in the bedroom, emerged into the hallway. He watched from the shadows as Slick grabbed his mother by the hair as he slammed her against the kitchen counter, as the other 2 men ransacked their already pathetic apartment looking for treasure that didn't exist. "Please," Diane begged, blood running from her nose. "Please, we don't have anything." "Marcus never told me about any money." Slick laughed, a sound like breaking bottles. "Then I guess you're paying his debt another way." What happened next lasted no more than 3 minutes, but for Charles Harrison, time became elastic, stretched, infinite. He watched as they brutalized his mother. He watched as she screamed his name, telling him to run, to hide, to save himself. He watched as Slick, frustrated by her continued denials, pulled a knife from his belt. Charles didn't run. He didn't scream. He didn't even move. He watched his mother die on that kitchen floor, 3 feet from where she'd been frying chicken just 2 hours earlier. He memorized every detail: the tattoo on Slick's neck, the smell of the cologne worn by the man in the doorway, the exact timbre of the 3rd man's laugh as they finally left, as they stepped over Diane Harrison's body like it was just another piece of garbage in a garbage neighborhood. When the police arrived 40 minutes later, called by Mrs. Delacroix, who had heard the screams, they found 12-year-old Charles sitting at the kitchen table, that book about codes and ciphers open in front of him, his mother's blood slowly spreading across the floor toward his feet. The officer who first entered the scene, Detective James Marino, would later testify that it was the calmest crime scene he'd ever witnessed. "The boy didn't cry," Marino told the court-appointed psychiatrist. "He didn't shake. He didn't show any emotion at all. He just looked up at me with these hollow eyes and said, 'I can identify all 3 of them. Every detail. When do I give my statement?' But there was no statement. There was no justice. Raymond "Slick" Peters was connected, a low-level enforcer for the Moretti family, one of the Italian operations that controlled Miami's gambling and protection rackets. The 2 men with him were never officially identified. The case was labeled insufficient evidence and quietly filed away, another unsolved murder in a neighborhood full of unsolved murders. Charles Harrison went into the foster care system. He was placed with a family in Overtown, then another in Hialeah, then another in Little Havana. He never stayed long. Not because he was violent or disruptive, quite the opposite. Foster parents found him unnerving. He was too quiet, too observant, too controlled. He made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. One foster mother, Elena Rodriguez, tried to connect with him. She caught him one night, 14 years old, sitting in the dark in his room, just staring at the wall. "Mio," she said softly, "you can talk to me. About your mother, about what happened. It might help." Charles turned to look at her, and in the dim light from the hallway, his face was completely expressionless. "What would help," he said quietly, "is if people understood that the world isn't fair, that monsters don't get punished. They get protected. They get to walk around free while good people die on kitchen floors." Elena never tried to reach him again. By 15, Charles had educated himself in ways no school could teach. He'd learned the streets, learned the hierarchies, learned who held power and how they maintained it. He'd discovered that Miami's underworld wasn't chaos, it was a system, as logical and ordered as any mathematical equation. And systems could be understood, manipulated, mastered. He'd also learned patience. While other kids his age were grabbing quick scores, getting caught, doing stupid time for stupid crimes, Charles played a longer game. He watched the numbers runners for the Morettis, memorizing their routes and schedules. He observed the Cuban smugglers moving cocaine through the port of Miami, noting their patterns and vulnerabilities. He studied the corrupt cops, cataloging which ones could be bought and which ones were true believers in their own twisted way. And late at night, in whatever temporary room he called home, Charles Harrison worked on his own code, a ledger of debts unpaid. At the top of the list, written in careful, precise handwriting, Raymond Slick Peters and 2 unidentified males. Last known location, Miami. On his 16th birthday, Charles Harrison walked out of his foster home with nothing but the clothes on his back and a backpack containing $2,400 he'd saved from various odd jobs and small hustles. He never looked back. The foster care system marked him as a runaway, filed the appropriate paperwork, and forgot about him. They would remember him eventually. Everyone would. Because the boy who had watched his mother die in silence was about to speak, and his language was violence, precise and calculated, delivered with the cold efficiency of a mathematical proof. The streets of Miami were about to meet their newest predator, and he was different from anything they'd seen before. He didn't want to be feared for show. He didn't want to be respected as a legend. He had no interest in the trappings of criminal royalty, the cars, the clothes, the clubs. Charles Harrison wanted only one thing: power. The kind of absolute, unquestionable power that would ensure no one could ever take from him again. The kind of power that would let him correct the equation that had been so violently unbalanced on that November night in 1967. In the coded language of his ledger, he had a name for this pursuit. He called it balancing. The streets would call it something else. They would call it execution. Every empire begins with a single act of violence, a line crossed that can never be uncrossed. For Charles Harrison, that line wasn't just crossed. It was obliterated. Miami, 1973. The city was transforming, shedding its retirement community image and embracing its destiny as America's gateway to Latin America and all the profitable sins that came with it. Cocaine was beginning its transformation from a rich man's indulgence to an epidemic gold rush. The old Italian families that had controlled gambling and prostitution for decades were suddenly facing competition from Cuban exiles who'd brought their own networks and a hunger sharpened by revolution and exile. It was chaos. Beautiful, profitable chaos. And into this chaos walked Charles Harrison, now 21 years old, invisible in his ordinariness. He wasn't 6'5" and built like a linebacker. He wasn't dressed in silk suits or dripping with gold chains. He stood 5'10", weighed maybe 160 pounds soaking wet, and could walk through a crowd without a single person remembering his face 5 minutes later. This was his greatest weapon. Charles had spent the 5 years since leaving foster care doing something unusual for someone in his circumstances. He'd gotten educated. Not in the traditional sense. He dropped out of high school at 16. But Charles Harrison understood that knowledge was power, and power was what he craved with an intensity that bordered on religious devotion. He'd worked legitimate jobs, warehouse work, delivery driving, dock labor at the port of Miami. Jobs that let him observe, that put him in proximity to the real action without making him a target. He'd learned Spanish by working alongside Cuban immigrants, learned Portuguese from Brazilian sailors, learned the basics of accounting by befriending a burned-out bookkeeper who spent his evenings at a bar Charles frequented. More importantly, he'd learned how the money moved. In Miami's criminal ecosystem, it wasn't the flashy dealers on street corners or the violent enforcers making the real money. It was the people who understood logistics, who could launder cash through legitimate businesses, who could move product efficiently while minimizing risk. Charles had discovered his natural aptitude for what would later be called criminal operations management. While other young hustlers were getting high on their own supply and bragging about their exploits in clubs, Charles was studying supply chains and probability theory. He read books on military strategy, on corporate management, on game theory. He approached crime as a science, not an art. His first real opportunity came through a man named Luis Ochoa, a mid-level cocaine distributor working for the Medellin suppliers but operating independently in Miami. Charles had met Luis at the docks. Luis used legitimate shipping manifests to move product, and Charles had been working cargo inspection at the time. One evening, as they shared cigarettes during a break, Luis complained about his growing problem. "I'm moving 3 times more product than I was 6 months ago," he said, frustrated. "But my profits, they're basically the same. Costs are eating me alive. Too many people taking cuts. Too much waste. Too much uncertainty." Charles listened in his characteristic silence, then asked a simple question. "Do you know exactly where every dollar goes?" Luis laughed. "It's not that simple, man. This business, you can't run it like you're selling cars." "Why not?" Charles asked, and something in his tone made Luis stop laughing. Over the next 2 weeks, Charles did something no one in Luz's operation had ever done. He created a complete audit of the distribution network. He tracked every handoff, every payment, every point where product or money changed hands. He calculated waste, identified redundancies, spotted the 3 guys in the operation who were skimming more than their share. When he presented his findings to Luis organized in a neat ledger that would become Charles's trademark, the Cuban stared at the numbers in disbelief. "You're telling me I'm losing 40% of my potential profit to bullshit that doesn't need to happen?" 42%, Charles corrected. And yes, Luis leaned back in his chair, studying this quiet young man who'd just dissected his entire operation with surgical precision. "What do you want?" 20% of what I save you. And I want to be there when you address the problems." The problems were 3 of Luz's most trusted distributors, men who'd been with him from the beginning, who considered themselves untouchable. When Luis confronted them with Charles's evidence, they laughed. They threatened. One of them, a loudmouth named Carlito Vega, even pulled a gun. Charles moved faster than anyone expected. He wasn't armed. He didn't carry weapons in those days, considering them inefficient and attention-drawing. But he'd studied anatomy with the same focus he'd applied to everything else. His hand struck Carlito's throat with precise force, crushing his trachea. As Carlito dropped, clawing at his neck and suffocating, Charles calmly disarmed him and turned to the other 2 men. "You have a choice," Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper. You can accept reduced points for your obvious theft and continue working, or you can end up like him. He gestured to Carlito, who had stopped moving on the floor. I'll need your decision in the next 30 seconds. They chose employment. Luis Ochoa stared at Charles with new eyes. This quiet, analytical kid had just killed a man with his bare hands and showed less emotion than someone swatting a fly. Jesus Christ, Luis breathed. Where the hell did you learn that? Books, Charles replied, which was technically true. He'd studied martial arts manuals, anatomy textbooks, interrogation techniques. But what books couldn't teach? The absolute absence of hesitation, the complete comfort with violence as a tool rather than an emotion. That was something that had been born in him on a November night in 1967. Within 3 months, Luce's operation was running with brutal efficiency. Profits had tripled. Word spread through Miami's underworld about the quiet kid who'd revolutionized Ochoa's distribution network. Other operators wanted to meet him, to hire him, to learn from him. Charles accepted select consulting jobs, always demanding the same thing: complete access to the organization's financial records and operational details, 20% of increased profits, and absolute authority to implement his recommendations. This last requirement often included violence-removing people who'd become liabilities, addressing competitors who threatened efficiency, solving problems that others considered unsolvable. He developed a reputation. People started calling him the accountant at first, then the problem solver. But the name that stuck, the name that would eventually be whispered with a mixture of fear and respect, came from a Colombian supplier who'd watched Charles calmly shoot 3 rival dealers who'd tried to ambush a shipment. He doesn't get angry, the Colombian had said, speaking in Spanish to his associates. He doesn't make it personal. He just executes, like it's a job on a list, the executioner. It fit perfectly. By 1975, at just 23 years old, Charles had worked with over a dozen different criminal operations, had a reputation for absolute reliability, and had amassed a carefully laundered fortune of just over $800,000. But he was still working for other people, still taking a percentage rather than controlling the whole pie. That was about to change. The opportunity came through tragedy, someone else's tragedy, which Charles had learned was often when opportunities presented themselves. Luis Ochoa, the man who'd given Charles his first real break, was killed in a shootout with a rival Cuban gang. His operation, now one of the most efficient in Miami, was up for grabs. Charles made his move with characteristic precision. He contacted Luce's suppliers in Colombia directly, something that was considered extremely disrespectful in the hierarchical world of drug trafficking. He offered them something no one else could, a guarantee of increased volume with decreased risk. I don't care about being a boss, Charles told them, which was true in the conventional sense. I care about efficiency. I'll run the operation, you'll supply the product, and everyone will make more money than they're making now. No ego, no flash, no attracting attention. Just business. The Colombians were skeptical. This kid, barely old enough to rent a car, wanted to take over a multi-million-dollar distribution network, but they'd heard the stories. They'd seen his work. And most importantly, Charles came to the meeting with something no one else had, a complete business plan, projected over 5 years with detailed financial analysis and risk mitigation strategies. One of the cartel representatives, a sharp-eyed man named Eduardo Vargas, read through Charles's proposal, and then looked up at him with something approaching respect. "You know what this reads like?" Eduardo asked. "This reads like a Fortune 500 expansion strategy, not a drug operation. What's the difference?" Charles asked. "Both are about moving product, maximizing profit, and minimizing risk. The product just happens to be illegal." Eduardo laughed a genuine, surprised laugh. "Okay, executor, we'll give you a test. 3 months. You show us you can do what you promise, and the supply is yours." Charles exceeded their expectations in 6 weeks. He restructured Luce's old network completely, firing anyone who was loyal to the old way of doing things and recruiting a new breed of worker people who understood that this was business, not some romantic gangster fantasy. He implemented cell structures, so if one part of the operation was compromised, it couldn't bring down the whole network. He diversified distribution points, used legitimate businesses as fronts, and created a money laundering system that moved cash through so many legitimate transactions that tracking it was nearly impossible. Most importantly, Charles instituted a policy that would become his trademark: absolute, brutal efficiency in dealing with problems. If someone stole, they disappeared. If someone talked to police, their whole family disappeared. If a rival encroached on his territory, Charles didn't negotiate. He simply eliminated them with surgical precision, leaving no witnesses and no evidence. The body count was considerable, but Charles never killed for show. Every death served a purpose, sent a message, solved a problem. He didn't leave bodies in public as warnings. That was inefficient and attracted police attention. People simply vanished, and the whispered stories about where they'd gone and what had happened to them were often more effective than any public display could be. By 1976, Charles the Executioner Harrison controlled the most efficient cocaine distribution network in South Florida. He was personally clearing $50,000 a week, money that was carefully laundered through a network of legitimate businesses he'd acquired: car washes, restaurants, rental properties, a small chain of laundromats. And through it all, Charles maintained his ghost-like existence. He didn't go to clubs, didn't throw parties, didn't surround himself with an entourage. He lived in a modest house in Coral Gables, drove a middle-class car, and could walk through Miami Beach without anyone recognizing him. But there was one thing Charles hadn't forgotten, one item at the top of his ledger that remained unbalanced. Raymond "Slick" Peters, the man who'd murdered his mother 9 years earlier, was still alive, still working enforcement for the Moretti family, still walking around free while Diane Harrison rotted in a pauper's grave. In December of 1976, Charles decided it was time to balance that particular equation. He spent 3 weeks studying Slick's patterns, learning his routines, identifying his vulnerabilities. He learned that Slick was a creature of habit: same bar every Tuesday night, same mistress every Thursday evening, same route home through the dimly lit streets of Little Havana. On a Tuesday night, as Slick walked to his car from his favorite bar, Charles stepped out of the shadows. Slick didn't recognize him at first. Why would he? The 12-year-old boy who'd watched his mother die had become a man, hardened and transformed. "Remember Diane Harrison?" Charles asked quietly. Slick paused, his hand moving toward the gun under his jacket. "Who?" "Liberty City. November 1967. You and 2 other men. You were looking for money that didn't exist." Recognition flickered in Slick's eyes, followed immediately by fear. His hand moved faster toward his gun, but Charles was faster. The knife entered below Slick's ribcage, angled upward toward the heart with anatomical precision. As Slick slumped against his car, Charles leaned in close and whispered, "She begged you. She told you she didn't have anything. You killed her anyway, and you laughed about it." Slick tried to speak, blood bubbling on his lips. "I've spent 9 years getting to this moment," Charles continued, his voice calm, almost conversational. "I've built an empire. I've become someone that people fear. And do you know why? Because I needed to become powerful enough that when I killed you, the Morettis wouldn't dare retaliate. Because I needed to make sure that your death wouldn't be investigated, wouldn't be avenged, wouldn't matter to anyone." He stepped back, watching as Slick's life drained away onto the pavement. "You taught me an important lesson that night," Charles said. "You taught me that monsters don't get punished unless someone punishes them. That justice doesn't happen unless you make it happen. That power is the only thing that matters in this world." Slick died without another word. Charles walked away, disposed of his clothes and the weapon in 3 different locations, and went home. He ate dinner, did some accounting work for one of his operations, and went to bed. The next morning, he crossed 1 name off his ledger. 2 more to go. The Moretti family, as Charles had predicted, didn't retaliate. By the time Slick's body was found, Charles had already sent word through intermediaries that the killing was a personal matter, settled and finished. And more importantly, Charles had become too valuable, too well-connected, and too dangerous to provoke over the death of a low-level enforcer. The message was clear to everyone in Miami's underworld. Charles, the executioner Harrison, had graduated from operative to untouchable. He was 24 years old. His empire was just beginning. Power, true power, isn't measured in the number of men who follow you. It's measured in the number of men who would never dare stand against you. Miami, 1978 to 1982. The city had become the cocaine capital of America, a neon-lit paradise where money moved faster than the conscience could keep up. The Colombians were shipping tons of powder through South Florida, and everyone with ambition and a gun wanted their piece of the American dream, narco style. In the middle of this chaotic gold rush stood Charles the Executioner Harrison, now 26 years old and in control of a criminal empire that stretched from the port of Miami to distribution networks in New York, Philadelphia, and Atlanta. His organization moved an estimated $20 million worth of cocaine annually, and those were the conservative estimates. But if you were looking for Charles in the usual places, the clubs where dealers flashed Rolexes and Corvettes, the restaurants where gangsters held court with beautiful women on their arms, the gaudy mansions that screamed, "Arrest me," you wouldn't find him. Charles had designed his empire on a simple principle that separated him from every other player in the game: invisibility. While his competitors were starring in their own gangster movies, Charles was running a corporation. A very illegal, very deadly corporation, but a corporation nonetheless. His headquarters wasn't a fortified compound or a strip club back room. It was a modest accounting firm in downtown Miami called Harrison Financial Services. The legitimate business provided tax preparation and bookkeeping for small businesses. The illegitimate business run from a soundproofed room in the basement managed the most sophisticated money laundering operation in South Florida. Charles had assembled a team that reflected his philosophy: competence over loyalty, intelligence over violence, efficiency over ego. His second-in-command wasn't a street thug or a childhood friend. It was a woman named Victoria Chun, a former forensic accountant who'd been disbarred for helping a client hide assets during a divorce. She was brilliant, ruthless in her own way, and shared Charles's view that organized crime should actually be organized. "You know what most criminals don't understand?" Victoria had said during her job interview, which had taken place in a coffee shop like they were discussing a position at IBM. "They don't understand that the money is more important than the drugs. The drugs are just inventory. But the money is what actually matters. And most of these idiots treat it like it's supposed to take care of itself." Charles had hired her on the spot. His enforcement arm was run by a former military man named Marcus Webb, no relation to his deceased father, despite sharing a first name. Webb had done 2 tours in Vietnam, seen things that had burned away whatever conscience he'd started with, and returned to civilian life with a very particular set of skills and no particular interest in using them legally. "I don't hire psychopaths," Charles had told Webb during his recruitment. "I don't hire people who enjoy violence. I hire people who understand violence as a tool, no different than a calculator or a ledger." "Can you do that?" Webb had thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "In the war, we called it problem solving. Some problems required diplomacy. Some required superior firepower. The good soldiers knew which was which. He'd been with Charles ever since. The empire Charles built between 1978 and 1982 was unlike anything Miami had seen before. He structured it in layers, each one insulated from the others, so that if law enforcement compromised one level, the rest would survive. At the street level, dealers who worked for him had no idea they were working for him. They dealt with mid-level managers who themselves reported to regional coordinators who finally answered to Charles's inner circle. Money moved through a maze of legitimate businesses. A dollar made selling cocaine on a Miami street corner might pass through a restaurant, get recorded as catering revenue, flow into a rental property management company, emerge as rental income, get invested in a car wash, and finally end up in an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, all completely untraceable. Charles didn't just launder money, he invested it. He bought real estate in gentrifying neighborhoods, acquired struggling businesses and turned them profitable, invested in the stock market through anonymous shell corporations. By 1980, even if law enforcement had seized every dollar connected to his drug operation, Charles Harrison would still have been a millionaire several times over from his legitimate holdings. But it wasn't just the structure that made Charles's empire formidable, it was his reputation. And that reputation was built on a very specific type of violence. The turning point came in the summer of 1979, when a rival organization run by a flashy Colombian named Roberto El Cocodrilo Menendez decided that Charles's territory looked profitable enough to take. El Cocodrilo was everything Charles wasn't: loud, violent, theatrical. He'd built his reputation on public executions, on making examples of his enemies in ways designed to terrify. He made the mistake of thinking Charles would be intimidated. It started with small encroachments, Menendez's dealers working corners that belonged to Charles's operation, undercutting prices, making noise about how the executioner was soft, how he was more accountant than gangster, how Miami needed a real boss. Charles's response was characteristically measured. He sent a message through intermediaries: cease operations in his territory within 48 hours or face consequences. El Cocodrilo laughed. He sent back a message of his own, the heads of two of Charles's street-level dealers, delivered to Harrison Financial Services in a cooler with a note that read, "Come take it back." It was a declaration of war. And Charles Harrison went to war the way he did everything, with mathematical precision. Over the next 72 hours, Menendez's entire operation simply disintegrated. His suppliers in Colombia received anonymous tips that Menendez was cooperating with the D-tips, supported by convincing forged documents that Victoria had created. His money laundering pipeline was exposed to law enforcement through a series of careful leaks. His distribution network found their normal routes blocked, their usual contacts suddenly unavailable, and his people started disappearing. Not in dramatic, public ways. No bodies left as warnings, they simply vanished. A lieutenant went out for cigarettes and never came home. A warehouse manager didn't show up for work and was never seen again. A trusted enforcer's car was found abandoned near the Everglades, but no body was ever recovered. The message was clear, and it was more terrifying than any public execution could be. Cross Charles Harrison, and you don't just die. You cease to exist. Your family never gets closure. You become a ghost story, a whispered warning, a cautionary tale told by survivors. Within a week, Menendez's operation had lost half its people. Some disappeared. Some arrested based on anonymous tips. Some simply quit and left Miami entirely. The suppliers cut him off. His money dried up. His reputation as an untouchable boss evaporated like morning fog. El Cocodrilo himself lasted 2 more weeks. He went into hiding, surrounded himself with guards, moved locations every night. It didn't matter. On a humid night in August, as Menendez sat in a safe house in Hialeah, surrounded by 6 armed men, the power went out. In the darkness, there were sounds, sharp, wet sounds, and when the power came back on 90 seconds later, all 6 guards were dead and Roberto Menendez was gone. His body was never found. But 3 days later, every major player in Miami's drug trade received an identical message. A single playing card, the ace of spades with a handwritten note. The debt is paid. The matter is closed. It was signed simply, E, for the executioner. After that, Charles Harrison's territory became sacrosanct. Other organizations might war with each other, might fight over scraps and corners and pride, but nobody, absolutely nobody, moved against the executioner. But Charles's infamy wasn't just built on violence. It was built on his absolute, almost supernatural ability to know things he shouldn't know. Rivals would have private conversations, and somehow Charles would know what was said. Police would plan raids, and somehow Charles's operations would shut down hours before law enforcement arrived. Witnesses would agree to testify, and somehow they'd change their minds, not through obvious intimidation, but through carefully applied pressure on things they cared about. The truth was simpler than the myth. Though no less impressive, Charles had done something very few criminals had the discipline or foresight to do. He'd built an intelligence network. He paid informants in every major organization. He had sources in the police department, the D, even the FBI field office. Not high-ranking officials selling out for big payoffs. Those were unreliable and dangerous. Instead, Charles cultivated secretaries, records clerks, low-level officers, people whose access to information was significant, but whose corruption seemed insignificant. A police clerk who made an extra $500 a month for occasionally mentioning when certain names came up in investigations. a D secretary who got her rent paid in exchange for casual mentions of what agents were working on which cases, a courthouse janitor who supplemented his income by photographing certain documents during his cleaning rounds. Individually, these sources provided fragments, but Charles and Victoria had created a system for assembling those fragments into actionable intelligence. They knew what law enforcement knew, sometimes before the agents themselves fully understood it. This made Charles's empire nearly untouchable, not because he was avoiding detection, but because he knew exactly where the attention was focused and could stay one step ahead. By 1982, at just 30 years old, Charles Harrison was one of the wealthiest and most powerful criminals in Florida. His legitimate net worth, the money that could be traced to legal businesses, was estimated at $15 million. His illegitimate fortune was probably 3 times that, carefully hidden in offshore accounts and untraceable assets. He owned a beautiful home in Coral Gables, drove luxury cars, though never the flashiest models, and had access to anything money could buy. But those who knew him really knew him, understood that Charles took little pleasure in his wealth. He didn't collect cars or jewelry. He didn't throw parties or surround himself with sycophants. He lived comfortably, but not extravagantly. What Charles collected was power, information, control, the ability to make things happen or prevent them from happening with a phone call or a quiet word. And there were still 2 names on his ledger, 2 men who'd been with Raymond Peters that night in 1967. Charles had never forgotten. He'd spent 15 years building himself into someone powerful enough to find them, to reach them, to end them without consequence. In late 1982, his sources finally identified them. One was serving time in federal prison for an unrelated conviction, easy enough to reach with the right connections. The other had relocated to Atlanta, working security for a strip club, thinking he'd put enough distance and time between himself and that night in Liberty City. They were both wrong. Charles handled it personally. The man in prison died in what was officially ruled a gang-related incident, sharpened toothbrush to the kidney during a routine movement between cells. The man in Atlanta disappeared after his shift one night, and even the most thorough police investigation turned up nothing but his abandoned car and a growing list of unpaid debts. Charles crossed the last 2 names off his ledger. After 15 years, the debt from that November night in 1967 was finally, completely paid. He should have felt satisfaction, closure, peace. He felt nothing at all. Because Charles Harrison had discovered something that many men who dedicate their lives to revenge eventually learn. Vengeance doesn't heal wounds. It doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't fill the hollow places that trauma carves into the soul. He'd built an empire, amassed a fortune, become feared and respected throughout the criminal underworld. He'd achieved everything he'd set out to achieve. And he was still a 12-year-old boy sitting at a kitchen table, watching his mother's blood spread across the floor, feeling absolutely nothing because feeling was too dangerous. But there was no time for reflection or existential crisis. Because while Charles had been building his perfect, efficient, controlled empire, the world around him had been changing. Miami was changing. The drug trade was changing. And the very efficiency and success that had made Charles powerful was about to paint a target on his back that not even his intelligence network could see coming. The fall was approaching, and it would begin, as these things often do, from the one place Charles had never thought to look, inside his own organization. every empire contains the seeds of its own destruction. The question is never if it will fall, only when and how much it will burn on the way down. Miami, 1983. The city was at war with itself. Cocaine money flowing so freely that the Federal Reserve Bank in Miami had a cash surplus larger than all other Federal Reserve branches combined. The violence had escalated beyond control. Bodies were dropping daily. Machine guns were standard equipment, and the national media had started calling South Florida America's Casablanca. Into this chaos, the federal government decided to make a statement. The Reagan administration had declared a war on drugs, and Miami was going to be the first major battle. The FBI, and local law enforcement were coordinating like never before, and they were coming with resources that made previous efforts look like amateur hour. Charles Harrison saw it coming. His intelligence network had been reporting increased federal activity for months. He knew the pressure was mounting. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the greatest threat to his empire wouldn't come from outside. It would come from his own success. The problem started with Marcus Webb, Charles's head of enforcement. For 5 years, Webb had been the perfect soldier, efficient, brutal when necessary, loyal. He'd handled dozens of problems for the organization, had built a crew of enforcers who operated with military precision. But somewhere along the line, Webb had started believing his own legend. It began subtly. Webb started talking more in meetings, making suggestions about strategy that went beyond his security portfolio. He started questioning decisions, pushing back on Charles's methodical approach. To the other members of the inner circle, it was clear what was happening. Webb was starting to see himself not as an employee, but as a partner. Maybe even as a potential successor. Victoria Chun noticed it first. "We have a problem," she told Charles during a private meeting in early 1983. "Marcus is getting ambitious. He's been having conversations with some of the mid-level people, not quite recruitment talks, but testing the waters, seeing who might be more loyal to him than to you." Charles listened with his characteristic calm, but inside, something cold and analytical was calculating probabilities. In his experience, there were only 2 ways this played out. Either Webb would make a move, or he'd need to be removed preemptively. "How certain are you?" Charles asked. 70%, Victoria said. "He's being careful." "But the pattern is there." 70%. In Charles's mathematical approach to the world, that was enough to act on. But there was a complication. Webb was popular with the enforcement crew. He'd built loyalty through shared danger, through violence, survived together. If Charles simply removed him, the way he'd removed dozens of other problems, there was a risk that Webb's people would fragment off, maybe even retaliate. Charles needed more information. He needed to know exactly how deep the betrayal went. He assigned one of his most trusted operatives, a former intelligence officer named David Reyes, to shadow Webb, to document his meetings, to build a complete picture of what was happening. What Reyes discovered was worse than Victoria had suspected. Webb wasn't just ambitious. He'd been approached by Roberto Menendez's former associates, the survivors of El Cocodrilo's organization who'd scattered after Charles had dismantled their operation 4 years earlier. They'd made Webb an offer, helped them take down the executioner, and they'd give him control of the combined territories. All the power, none of the subservience. And Webb was seriously considering it. The evidence was conclusive. Reyes had surveillance photos, recordings from a listening device planted in Webb's car, testimony from an informant inside Webb's crew. There was no doubt. Charles called a meeting of his inner circle: Victoria, Reyes, and 3 other key operatives who'd been with him from the early days. He laid out the evidence methodically, letting them reach their own conclusions. "He has to go," one of them said. "Tonight." But Charles shook his head. "If we just kill him, his crew splinters. Some stay loyal to us, some go independent, some join our competitors. We lose operational efficiency, we show weakness, and we potentially create 3 or 4 new problems instead of solving one. So what do you want to do?" Victoria asked. Charles leaned back, his mind working through scenarios like a chess computer calculating permutations. "We don't just remove Webb, we remove the entire problem: Webb, his potential allies, and the Menendez remnants, all at once. We make it so complete that there's no question, no ambiguity, no room for anyone else to get ideas." What Charles planned over the next 2 weeks would become known in Miami's underworld as the Purge, a 72-hour period in April 1983 when over 20 people connected to the attempted coup simply vanished. Charles's approach was surgical. He identified everyone in Webb's crew who'd shown even marginal loyalty to Webb over the organization. He pinpointed the former Menendez associates who'd approached Webb. He mapped out the entire conspiracy network. And then, on a Friday night, he executed the plan with the cold efficiency that had made him legendary. Webb himself was first. Charles handled it personally, not out of anger or a need for revenge, but because Webb deserved that much. He'd been a good soldier before the ambition poisoned him. Charles invited him to a private meeting at a warehouse under the pretense of discussing a major operation. When Webb arrived, Charles was waiting alone. "You know why you're here," Charles said. It wasn't a question. Webb's hand moved toward his weapon, but he stopped. He'd seen Charles move before. He knew it would be futile. "The Menendez people approached you 3 months ago," Charles continued. "You've had 7 meetings with them. You've discussed transition plans, territory divisions, how to handle my removal. You've identified 6 people in my organization you think you can flip to your side." Webb stared at him, and for the first time since Charles had known him, the former soldier looked genuinely afraid. "How long have you known?" Webb asked quietly. "Since the second meeting," Charles replied. "I've been watching, documenting, building the complete picture. You're not the only problem, Marcus. You're just the most visible one. Are you going to tell me I should have just asked for more money? That I should have been patient?" There was an edge of defiance in Webb's voice now. "No," Charles said. "You wanted power. I understand that. But you were sloppy. You let ambition make you reckless. And in this business, recklessness is fatal." The silenced pistol made almost no sound. Webb dropped without another word. Over the next 72 hours, the rest of the conspiracy unraveled. Webb's closest associates were picked up one by one, taken to secure locations, and dealt with. The former Menendez people found themselves targeted with the same precision that had destroyed their original organization. By Monday morning, the threat was completely eliminated. And Charles had sent a message to everyone in his organization. Loyalty wasn't rewarded with sentiment, but disloyalty was punished with absolute finality. But the purge had consequences Charles hadn't fully calculated. First, it drew attention. 20 people disappearing in 3 days, even in Miami's violent landscape, was noticeable. The police started asking questions. The D opened a task force. The media ran stories about a gang war and a mysterious figure called the executioner who supposedly controlled half the drug trade in South Florida. Charles had always operated on the principle of invisibility. The Purge had made him visible. Second, it scared people. Not just rivals or potential enemies, it scared his own organization. People started wondering if they were next, if some innocent conversation or casual complaint might be interpreted as disloyalty. The efficiency and cold precision that Charles prized started to feel like paranoia and tyranny to the people working for him. Morale dropped. Trust evaporated. People started looking for exits. Third, and perhaps most critically, it gave federal law enforcement something they'd never had before: witnesses. In the paranoid aftermath of the Purge, 3 mid-level people in Charles's organization decided that cooperation with the D was safer than staying in an empire that had just demonstrated its willingness to eliminate its own people. The first cooperator was a money courier named Jennifer Rodriguez, who'd been dating one of Webb's crew members. She didn't have access to the top level of the organization, but she could testify about money movement, about properties used for laundering, about the legitimate businesses that were fronts. The second was a warehouse manager named Thomas Delgado, who'd survived the Purge by pure luck. He'd been on Webb's list of potential allies, but hadn't been contacted yet. Terrified that he might be next, he walked into a D office in May 1983 and offered everything he knew. The third was the most damaging, Victor Martinez, one of Charles's regional coordinators who had access to the organizational structure, the financial systems, the methods of operation. By July 1983, the federal case against Charles Harrison was building momentum. The prosecutors had insider testimony, financial records, surveillance to corroborate the testimony. They had enough to bring charges, serious charges, that could put Charles away for the rest of his life. Charles saw it coming. His intelligence network, the same network that had protected him for years, started reporting ominous signs. Grand jury proceedings, immunity deals, assets being frozen. The machine he'd built so perfectly was being taken apart piece by people who'd once been parts of that machine. He called a meeting with Victoria Chun. "How bad is it?" he asked. She didn't sugarcoat it. Catastrophic. They have the structure. They have the money flow. They have testimony that puts you directly at the center of everything. And the way federal RICO statutes work, they don't need to prove you personally committed every crime. They just need to prove you led the organization. Timeline: indictments within 60 days. Maybe sooner. Charles sat in silence, his analytical mind working through scenarios. He could run. He had the resources, the connections, the ability to disappear. Several countries with no extradition treaties would welcome him and his money. He could fight hire the best lawyers, attack the witnesses' credibility, drag it out for years. Or he could accept what was becoming increasingly clear. His empire, built on efficiency and cold calculation, was crumbling from the inside out. The very systems that had made him successful had become predictable, vulnerable. He'd treated his organization like a machine, but machines are made of parts that can break, can be replaced, can turn against their original purpose. "What do you want to do?" Victoria asked. Charles looked at her, this brilliant woman who'd been his most trusted advisor for 5 years. "I want you to disappear," he said. "Take your share, get out." They don't have enough on you to make a case stick, but they might try to use you to get to me. Don't give them the chance. What about you?" "I'm going to fight," Charles said. "Not because I think I can win, but because running would be an admission that they broke me. And I don't break." Victoria left that night. Charles never saw her again, though he heard years later that she'd relocated to Barcelona and was running a legitimate financial consulting firm. Her criminal past buried under layers of false identity and careful reinvention. The indictment came on August 15, 1983. 17 counts: drug trafficking, money laundering, racketeering, and 3 counts of murder conspiracy. The federal prosecutor held a press conference, dramatically announcing the arrest of one of South Florida's most dangerous and elusive criminal masterminds. Charles Harrison, the executioner, was arrested without incident at his home in Coral Gables. When the FBI agents arrived with a warrant, he was sitting at his kitchen table, working on financial spreadsheets. He offered no resistance, asked for his lawyer, and said nothing else. The trial began in February 1984. Charles hired the best defense attorney his money could buy, a man named Richard Castellano, who'd successfully defended several major mob figures. Castellano's strategy was to attack the credibility of the cooperating witnesses, to argue that they were self-serving criminals trying to reduce their own sentences by fabricating testimony against an innocent businessman. It didn't work. The evidence was too comprehensive, the testimony too detailed and corroborated. Jennifer Rodriguez described the money laundering operations with specific dates and amounts. Thomas Delgado walked the jury through the organizational structure, explaining how insulation and compartmentalization protected the top level. Victor Martinez provided the financial records that proved Charles's position at the center of everything. And there were the bodies, or rather, the absence of bodies. The prosecution brought in family members of people who disappeared after crossing Charles Harrison's organization. They couldn't prove murder without bodies, but they could establish a pattern, cross the executioner, and you vanish. Charles watched it all with the same cold detachment he'd brought to everything in his life. He didn't show emotion when witnesses described his orders. He didn't react when prosecutors painted him as a monster. He sat perfectly still, perfectly calm, perfectly controlled. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts, guilty. At sentencing, the judge, an older man named Harold Sherman, who'd seen the worst of Miami's cocaine wars, looked at Charles with something that might have been pity. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Sherman said, "you are clearly an intelligent man. You built something that would be impressive if it weren't so destructive. But you chose to use your gifts to traffic in poison, to destroy lives, to kill anyone who stood in your way. You showed no mercy to your victims. This court will show none to you." The sentence was life imprisonment without possibility of parole, plus an additional 150 years on the other counts. At 32 years old, Charles the Executioner Harrison would never be a free man again. As the marshals led him out of the courtroom, Charles caught sight of one person in the gallery, an older black woman he didn't immediately recognize. Then he realized it was Mrs. Delacroix, his mother's neighbor from Liberty City, the woman who'd called the police that night in 1967. Their eyes met for just a moment. She wasn't there to gloat or to celebrate. She was there, Charles understood, to bear witness. To see that the boy who'd watched his mother die had finally stopped watching, started acting, and ended up exactly where that path always led. Charles Harrison was transported to USP Atlanta, a maximum security federal prison. He was 32 years old. His empire was gone, his fortune seized, his organization scattered to the winds. He'd spent 20 years building power, 15 years pursuing revenge, and 5 years at the top of a criminal empire. And now he would spend the rest of his life in a cell with nothing but time to reflect on whether any of it had mattered. In the end, we're all just stories told by survivors. The question is, what does your story teach? Federal Correctional Institution, Coleman, Florida. The present day. Charles, the executioner Harrison, is 68 years old now. He's been incarcerated for over 40 years, more than half his life spent inside federal prisons. His hair, what's left of it, is gray. His body, once lean and efficient, has thickened with age and institutional food. But his eyes, those eyes that Mrs. Delacroix called old when he was just a child, those haven't changed at all. He spends his days much as he spent them on the outside, observing, calculating, finding patterns in chaos. In prison, he's known as the professor. He tutors younger inmates in mathematics and accounting. He helps prisoners understand the legal paperwork for their appeals. He plays chess in the yard, thinking 36 moves ahead while his opponent struggles with the next 2. Guards who've worked with him for years describe him as the easiest lifer we have. He follows rules, stays out of trouble, treats everyone with distant professionalism. He's never been involved in a single violent incident during his incarceration, ironic, given the body count that put him there. In 2015, a true crime documentary crew got permission to interview Charles for a series about Florida's drug wars. The interview, conducted in a small room with security glass between Charles and the camera, would become one of the most watched true crime segments of the decade. The interviewer, a young journalist named Sarah Mills, who hadn't even been born when Charles was convicted, asked him the question everyone wanted answered. Looking back on your life, do you have any regrets? Charles was silent for a long moment, his face completely neutral. Then he said, "Regret implies that you would make different choices if given the opportunity. I don't think in those terms. I made decisions based on the information and circumstances I had at the time. Those decisions led to predictable outcomes. Regret would be illogical, but the people who died were obstacles, threats, or enemies," Charles interrupted, his voice calm and factual. "This is what people don't understand about that world. It's not personal. It's mathematics. Every action has a reaction. Every decision has a cost and a benefit. I calculated those costs and acted accordingly. And the cost of your own freedom, was that calculated?" For the first time in the interview, something flickered across Charles's face, not emotion exactly, but perhaps recognition. "No," he admitted. "I failed to calculate the human variable properly. I treated my organization like a machine, and machines are predictable. People aren't. I optimized for efficiency and power, but I didn't account for the fact that fear, even rational fear, makes people unpredictable. That was my mistake." The interview went viral. Criminologists analyzed it. Psychology professors used it in classes. But what fascinated people most was Charles's complete absence of remorse. He didn't justify his actions, didn't try to paint himself as a victim or a hero. He simply described his life as a series of logical decisions that had led to logical outcomes. It was chilling in its honesty. But there's more to Charles Harrison's legacy than cold calculation and bodies buried in the Everglades. In a strange way, His story became a cautionary tale that actually worked. In the years after his conviction, as the story of the executioner spread through Miami's criminal underworld, something unexpected happened. A generation of would-be gangsters looked at his life and reached a different conclusion than he had. They saw a man who'd done everything right by criminal standards. He'd been smart, careful, disciplined, efficient. He'd avoided the typical pitfalls. He wasn't a drug addict, wasn't flashy, didn't trust the wrong people, built a sophisticated operation. And he still ended up in prison, losing everything, dying slowly in a cell. If the executioner, the smartest, coldest, most calculating criminal of his generation, couldn't beat the system, what chance did anyone else have? These statistics show that recruitment into major drug trafficking organizations in South Florida dropped significantly in the late 1980s and early 1990s. While correlation isn't causation, more than one federal agent has theorized that Charles Harrison's story, widely known, carefully documented, impossible to romanticize, may have actually deterred crime in a way that all the drug war propaganda never could. Because Charles's story destroyed the myth that if you're just smart enough, careful enough, ruthless enough, you can win at the crime game. He proved that even if you do everything right, the ending is the same: prison or death, no exceptions. His former associates had varied fates. Victoria Chen, as mentioned, disappeared into Europe with a new identity and reportedly a substantial hidden fortune. She was smart enough to quit while she was ahead, something Charles never managed to do. Marcus Webb's family never learned what happened to him. His body, like so many others, was never recovered. He exists now only in case files and cautionary tales. The cooperating witnesses who testified against Charles served reduced sentences and entered witness protection. At least 2 of them have been found dead over the years, whether from old enemies or just the hard living that often follows a life in crime. No one knows for certain. The money, that vast fortune Charles accumulated, was largely seized by federal authorities. Some was returned to communities affected by drug trafficking. Some funded anti-drug programs. Some probably ended up absorbed into bureaucratic expenses and quietly disappeared. Charles's legitimate business holdings were sold off. The house in Coral Gables became home to a tech entrepreneur. The rental properties were acquired by a real estate investment trust. The laundromats and car washes changed hands multiple times, their criminal origins forgotten. It's as if Charles Harrison's empire never existed, except in the memories of those who lived through it, and in the federal records that document every dollar and every decision. But perhaps the most profound part of Charles's legacy has to do with that ledger, the list he started at 16, the debt he spent 15 years preparing to collect. In 2019, a journalist researching Charles's early life tracked down the case file from Diane Harrison's murder. She discovered something that had been buried in the paperwork. Raymond Peters wasn't actually involved in Diane's death. He'd been arrested that night for drunk and disorderly conduct on the other side of Miami. He had an airtight alibi, confirmed by police records. The 3 men who actually murdered Diane Harrison were never identified. They likely weren't even connected to Peters, just random predators who kicked in the wrong door, looking for money that didn't exist. Charles had spent 15 years preparing to kill the wrong man, and he'd built his entire life philosophy, his cold calculation, his ruthless efficiency, his pursuit of power around avenging a crime that Peters hadn't committed. When the journalist brought this information to Charles in prison, expecting some kind of breakdown or dramatic revelation, he simply nodded. "I see," he said. That would explain why Peter seemed genuinely confused before he died. "Doesn't that bother you?" the journalist asked, shocked by his calm. "You built your entire life around avenging your mother, and you killed an innocent man. Well, not innocent, but innocent of that particular crime." Charles was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that the journalist would remember for the rest of her life. "The foundation doesn't matter if the building is sound. I told myself I was pursuing justice, but that was just the story I needed to justify what I wanted to do anyway. I wanted power. I wanted control. I wanted to ensure that no one could ever make me feel helpless again. My mother's murder was just the catalyst, not the cause. If it hadn't been that, it would have been something else. It was, perhaps, the closest Charles Harrison ever came to self-awareness. Today, criminology professors use Charles's case when teaching about the psychology of criminal enterprise. Business schools bizarrely sometimes reference his organizational structures when discussing efficient management, carefully divorced from the criminal context, of course. True crime enthusiasts debate whether he's a psychopath, a sociopath, or simply a damaged person who found destructive ways to cope with childhood trauma. The truth, as always, is probably more complicated than any label can capture. Charles Harrison was a child who watched his mother die and learned that the world was violent, unjust, and indifferent. He was an intelligent person who applied that intelligence to the most destructive possible path. He was a criminal who approached crime with the logic of a military strategist and the morality of a mathematician. Pure calculation, no emotion, just inputs and outputs. He was efficient, careful, brilliant in his own twisted way. And he lost everything anyway. Because that's the secret that every career criminal learns eventually, usually too late. The house always wins. The system, law enforcement, federal prosecutors, the sheer weight of statistical probability is designed to catch you eventually. You can delay it, postpone it, maybe even avoid it for years or decades. But in the end, you're either going to prison, dying violently, or if you're very lucky and very smart, you get out before the bill comes due. Charles Harrison never got out. He calculated every variable except the most important one, himself. He optimized for power and efficiency, but never stopped to ask whether power and efficiency were worth the cost of his humanity. He sits in Coleman now, an old man teaching young inmates how to factor polynomials, playing chess in the yard, reading books about probability theory and game strategy. He's outlived most of his enemies and quite a few of his former associates. And every day he faces the same calculation. Was it worth it? By his own mathematical standards, probably not. He traded his freedom, his remaining family relationships, any chance at normal human connection for about 15 years of power and wealth he couldn't ultimately keep. By any human standards, certainly not. But Charles Harrison stopped thinking in human terms when he was 12 years old, sitting at a kitchen table covered in his mother's blood. He became the executioner, a living equation, a ghost in a machine of his own design. And like all ghosts, he's trapped in the moment that made him, unable to move forward, unable to escape, just endlessly repeating the same pattern. Calculate, execute, survive, repeat. The story of Charles, the executioner Harrison, is a reminder that intelligence without wisdom, power without purpose, and efficiency without humanity lead nowhere worth going. The criminal underworld promises freedom but delivers only cages, some made of steel bars, some made of paranoia and fear, all of them prisons nonetheless. If you're fascinated by tales from the dark corners of history, stories of rise and fall, power and consequence, choices made and prices paid, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment below telling us which gangster or criminal empire you'd like to explore next. And remember, the most successful con in criminal history is convincing young people that there's a smart way to play a losing game. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay on the right side of the law, 'cause as Charles Harrison proved, even if you're smarter than everyone else, the math always catches up eventually.